I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Glenn Fox. Dr. Fox is a neuroscientist and lecturer at the USC Marshall School of Business, where he studies the neural systems of gratitude, empathy, and emotion regulation as they pertain to entrepreneurial and leadership mindsets. Glenn, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So Glenn, you've managed to connect two very interesting and diverse fields, neuroscience and business. I'd love to hear more about your background and how this crossover developed.
Well, it's a pretty long story, and some of it is intentional, but I'm happy to share. So I've always just been interested in how things work, and I'm most curious about how really complicated things work. And anytime I find a system in which there's many complicated and convoluted relationships, something about my brain just becomes interested in that. And in college, I set out to become a mechanic and restore old cars. And because I thought that the automobile was a really interesting system. And I really enjoyed working with old cars and spent the summers during college doing that and restoring and painting and refinishing and pulling and putting in motors and doing a lot of really fun activities that I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about what made me happy. I learned a lot about what rewarding work felt like. I learned a lot about how projects unfold and the questions and problems you have to solve that you never thought you'd have to. And I began to wonder more about how I could connect this to other things I was really interested in. At the time, I was basically floundering in college. I won't tell you my life story, don't worry. But
No worries.
At the time, I was basically floundering in college. I was always a decent, in high school as a decent student, but I didn't really care very much about that. I liked learning. I've always liked learning. I've never been a slacker, never disliked things, but I never really cared for school.
Right.
So it's funny that I ended up spending 7 years in graduate school after college.
Yeah.
We'll get to that. So I pursued this and just started thinking about how could I pursue my interest in cars and machines and relate it to my other great natural interest in the brain and the mind. That led me to studying psychology at UC Santa Cruz. And I just happened to have a mentor who was instrumental in pointing me toward my current career. And she said, if all you're interested in is the brain, you should study the brain. So go figure. But sometimes you need a mentor to tell you something really obvious. At that point, I started volunteering in a lab at Stanford and getting some some background in brain imaging. Yet I was still trying to put all this stuff together. So I'll fast forward us a little bit. So I ended up pursuing that all the way through to my PhD in neuroscience, which I got a few years ago. And toward the end of my PhD, after studying gratitude in the brain for so many years, I was proud of the work that I had done, but I was concerned that not a lot of people would read about it. And this fits a broader trend in science that there's a lot of good science. People know very little about it. Scientists show very little care to explain it to them. Is my somewhat crass and cynical take on a lot of science, is that most of it sits on a shelf. Most of it is science for science sake and not applied to everyday lives and workplaces. Given this frustration and a certain level of burnout and also just a very tough job market, I again started doing this sort of soul searching of how can I put the stuff I like together? How can I find more themes that are really interesting in terms of what people are working on? And I started thinking about, the people that I really look up to, and maybe I could find ways to work with them. One of those people was Pete Carroll, as a coach of the Seattle Seahawks. And I had no entree to Pete. This is the craziest story. But I've always enjoyed Pete. You are a USC person as well, Adam. And so we're big fans of Pete, of course. And when I was in graduate school, he was the coach for most of the time. Some of the time I was in graduate school. and I just would see him around campus, and I just think that that guy's doing something cool. Like he's doing something amazing there, right? Just his ambiance and the way he spoke about his players. And I just had in my mind that it would be really cool to work with this person somehow. And it just is the most crazy story, because when I was finishing my postdoc, and again, floundering a little bit, I came in contact with Pete, and we did this project called the Performance Science Institute. And it was, the goal was to take everything that I was learning about human thriving and translate it into things people could do to perform at a better level. I've evolved quite a bit since then. Now I think the word performance, we should talk about this maybe if you want, but
Yeah,
I think the word performance is not the way to go. I think pursuit is a better word. And we can talk about why and my derivation for that, but it was, the interest became like, okay, well, what does it look like when we perform at our best? What does it look like? What is the meaning of performance? So I worked with Pete and a guy named Michael Gervais, and we spent a few years, and I realized that, well, I learned a ton. It was an incredible experience. And we worked with a lot of really high performing people. So we worked with the Reconnaissance Marines with my friend Leslie Saxon, who runs the Center for Body Computing. And we spent 3 years studying the Reconnaissance Marines and asking the question, what makes a successful recon Marine? What makes the mindset of a successful recon Marine? Right. And how can we track and take a look at what those people do maybe a little differently?
So were you thinking about this from your neuroscience perspective in terms of like individual differences in the brain, like these people are built differently, or is it more like a set of cognitive skills that are acquired?
I'm not sure you can disentangle them so easily. I was certainly thinking about it. I was thinking mostly in terms of the emotion. I'm much more focused on emotion than cognition. And by the way, cognition and emotion are roughly equivalent. There's so much overlap between them, and you need both very clearly. And I'm really, really focused on the world of emotion. I'm really focused on how we feel things, how we become conscious of our feelings, or better stated, how we become conscious of our emotions, which thus create feelings, and how we think and how we act as a result of these feelings is the core element of the thing I'm most interested in. So in terms of our Marines, I was very confident that we would find differences in terms of the emotion regulation skills or predisposition, however you like to frame it. I was confident we would find differences between those who moved ahead in the training and those who did not. And we did. We found very profound differences. And we found that physical skills were important for people who did not quit. All right, let me start that sentence again. We found that physical skills were, of course, necessary, but most of the people who start reconnaissance training are physically gifted to begin with. Most of the people who work there or try to become recon Marines can already run 3 miles in under 18 minutes, right? So they're already pretty fit people. But the ones who quit are the ones with the better disposition, the better mental disposition. Or sorry, the ones who do not quit. The ones who do not quit are the ones with the better. So you
could be at the same level of fitness, but then there's the mental willpower to go or not go.
Exactly. And it might be willpower, it might be something else. And I actually think it's a lot of our ability to integrate pain with a cohesive personal narrative.
Right. And when you say pain, is that not just physical pain, but also like stress and emotional pain and things like that?
Absolutely. I think of pain with very little distinction between physical and emotional pain. We saw early in my graduate career, we did a study of witnessing people in pain and seeing the regions of the brain involved were pretty much the same as if you were experiencing pain. This is a system that's not studied as much anymore. This is kind of an old topic in neuroscience, to give you a sense of the neuroscience literature, but this topic called the pain matrix. And the idea being that the pain matrix is pretty much active, whether or not it's physical or social pain, and whether you experience it yourself or whether you observe it in others, some elements of the nodes of this network will become involved, using fMRI to measure this. So a pretty coarse instrument, but there are a lot of universal traits to our pain. Here's an interesting finding we found in the research with the Marines. We looked at their essays for when they were coming into the Marine Corps. So we looked at what did they say, or sorry, not the Marine Corps, the recon school. This is after they were already Marines, and now they had to write little essays before they started reconnaissance training. We had a team of 3 amazing undergraduate students who deserve all the credit. So Kelly, Harrison, I'm saying their names because they deserve it, but Kelly, Harrison, Hannah, and Paul, and Naviata were my students who literally coded by hand 2,000 some odd essays and digitized this record. See why? That's why I use their name. They did a ton of work. They're amazing. Each of those students is doing like incredible stuff now, which is really cool to see. But in this result, we looked at what kinds of things did the people talked about who graduated or who did not graduate. So were there differences based on the motivation, based on why you wanted to become a reconnaissance Marine? What's the hardest thing you've ever gone through? And we looked at how their answers predicted graduation or not graduation. Again, this study, another person involved, Trevor Barrett, who's a postdoc at the Center for Body Computing, did the bulk of the work on this study, not me. So thanks to Trevor, we're talking about this. But what we did find was that the people who said that some personal tragedy was the hardest thing they'd ever gone through were much more likely to quit. Right. So we see that these things matter at a deep level. Now, the interesting thing is the people who talked about some form of a rite of passage, some sort of a physical or mental rite of passage being the hardest thing they'd ever gone through, those people were much less likely to quit. So these things are really, really important. The mind is really important, go figure, but it has really tangible outcomes for anything we choose to pursue. And sorry to interrupt me when you want, but I'll say this is kind of the closing part of the story of how we got to now, which is I started looking at what other venues are the hardest things for people to do. What's the hardest thing for our mind? What's the hardest thing for us in terms of the emotional stressors that we can have? Because at the Marines, you have this physical element that's always hanging around. And I looked around, and I've always loved entrepreneurship. I've always loved entrepreneurs. I have a very entrepreneurial spirit myself. And I was working in the Entrepreneurial Studies department. Actually, that's where my home department was with the Institute. And I just became more and more involved in entrepreneurs and the study of entrepreneurs, and realized that the act of founding a company is on par with the hardest mental and emotional things we can do in our careers. I think it absolutely is just about as hard a thing as you can ever do. And there's a reason why I switched from studying recon Marines to founders, because the mental stresses are comparable for a lot of people. And the burnout, the workload you got to put in, the endurance, the humor, the humility, the perseverance, it all comes together for founders. And so that's my job now is taking all these models and applying neuroscience and performance science to entrepreneurship. And it's an absolute blast. I would encourage anybody studying entrepreneurship is really interesting. It's a really unique field because it's a field of study dedicated to like one specific kind of pursuit. It's interesting. If you imagine if people studied doctors, like we're in the doctor study. It's just it's such a unique pursuit, such a unique thing for people to do to start a business that there's an entire academic field around it. And it's been really fruitful. And so bringing these neuroscience and performance science frameworks to helping founders think and handle and deal with the stress is my core work now, and of course teaching entrepreneurs and teaching entrepreneurship from the perspective of neuroscience is doubly fruitful, because then we can understand marketing and value proposition and team building and organization and all sorts of challenges that entrepreneurs face in the logistics of running a company also can be filtered through neuroscience with great benefit to their outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm seeing the connection there. So it seems like a tragedy is something that sort of happens to you. It's not as active versus this rite of passage, whether that's like joining the Marines or founding a business. It's something that's very voluntary.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, look, too, we're also not saying, it's interesting. It's not that the people who went through the rite of passage didn't have personal tragedies. It's that they didn't report it as being the hardest thing they'd ever done. And that's really interesting, right? That itself is really interesting, because there's all kinds of background noise against it. And we have this thought that fail forward fast and failure is good and all that stuff. And yes, you have to be willing to fail. I think that how that failure is internalized, just like you're saying, is critical, because trauma doesn't just thicken our skin, it leaves us wounded. And without a right story around trauma, it makes future challenges that much more difficult. So we have a challenge as a society. I think that we need to reframe these traumas in terms of growth and in terms of their ability to help us grow, in order for us to not have the echoes of these traumas play out in whatever we pursue down the line. And we see it with that data set that I think is such a stark reminder that people are much more likely to develop post-traumatic stress who've already gone through something very stressful. So it's kind of a weird thing, but I think it has to do with the story that we tell and the ruggedness of that story in terms of our overarching narrative of our life. I think if we are constantly feeling that we're vulnerable, which trauma can remind us of that. It's not that trauma teaches us something new. It reminds us of the truth that we are all vulnerable. But keeping that as a backdrop at all times is very tough to deal with. So I think that's these emotional backdrops underneath our pursuits is really, really important, and learning to reframe and think about them from a biological standpoint can really help us contextualize.
So in terms of nature and nurture, to what extent is this emotional resilience like have to do with genes or temperament versus like it's a strategy that you learn over time and can get better at?
I mean, I definitely don't see much, I would never advocate for one over the other.
Yeah, it's always both to some extent.
It's clearly both. There's some interesting research. There's probably a lot that I don't know about the genetics of trauma. I know for gratitude, there's some studies showing slight differences in the expression of oxytocin receptors based on a genetic profile that may seem to indicate differences there. There's, so if that subtle finding can be there for something as vague as like gratitude, then there's no reason to think that there can't be other genetic dispositions to this or that. Gratitude is interesting in the sense that we know our personality is largely heritable, right? Like very much so. So the big five, what is currently the standard of personality metrics of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism are the most commonly cited. I think the research on the big five is actually really good. And I mean, the way it was discovered, the way they set up that framework, I'm a big fan of it. So, and those things have been tied to heritability, and they've been really well. It's very robust. Gratitude is a unique trait among those five. So gratitude is a unique trait that predicts subjective well-being above any of the big five personality traits. This was research done by Alex Woods, and it's super interesting to say that gratitude may be a unique predictor of our mental health above and beyond our baseline heritable personality traits. So is it learned, is it intrinsic, or is it innate? I don't know. But anybody can learn about it. research has shown that people who are highly prone to gratitude have many benefits. But there's also a wonderful sub story in the research. If you look really, really closely, you can see that in interventions focused on gratitude, the biggest benefits to subjective well-being come from people who begin as rather ungrateful and then move towards gratitude. So those people actually drive a lot of the results we see when we talk about the benefits of practicing gratitude. What's really cool is that those benefits are mostly there because of people who maybe start out not thinking about gratitude, not thinking it's particularly important or whatever, and go forward with practicing gratitude. They enroll in these experiments, and then luckily play along with the game enough to fill out their gratitude journals every day, and over time learn to become more grateful and thus experience the benefits and upsides of it. Right. So in terms of our native predisposition to gratitude, of course, it's going to be a mix of genetics and environment. Absolutely. Where's that line or whatever? I have no idea. But I do know that the practice of gratitude is available for anyone. So even if you didn't start out as grateful, you can certainly do something every day to become more grateful. And that there is evidence from a number of studies now showing that does change our biology. So the causality loop here, I think, is also hard to determine. There are people like Ed Diener, who passed away recently, who literally said that these emotions and the practice of these emotions is the cause of well-being, that these things cause us to feel better, which is an incredible claim for a scientist to make. You never say causality, that never say causes this. It's like just verboten in science to say something causes something else, unless you're a physicist, I guess. Right. So this is a big claim, and it's very well supported by data that these things have a causal relationship to our well-being. I'm fully comfortable saying it. It's not the same for everybody. It doesn't mean if everybody tries, everybody gets it, which I guess limits it, but it can have a causal one-to-one A to B relationship between things. So in terms of entrepreneurial mindset, in terms of thinking like an entrepreneur, in terms of that ruggedness and that resilience that entrepreneurs show so often, this is what we're experimenting with right now, is how do we develop both the benefits of entrepreneurial mindset insofar as creativity, resilience, innovation, adaptability, risk tolerance, the skill of optimism, and also remedy some of the more negative effects of founding related to burnout and stress and loss of sleep and all those other things. So I think that there's a two-pronged approach to studying entrepreneurial mindset that's rooted in neuroscience and physiology, where we can have really physiologically grounded models of entrepreneurial pursuit with a lot of skills that we can train and teach people.
And how does this relate to certain stereotypes of business leaders, like in terms of being cutthroat or very high stakes, like sort of the opposite of grateful and empathetic and things like that?
That's an interesting question. I mean, a lot of those are largely stereotypes. I mean, we do see that optimism is one of the most common traits of successful founders. I think that, of course, there can be a cutthroat nature to business, but I think if you're really harming people's truth or trust in you, if you're really disrupting people's trust, people won't work with you. It's a small world, and you need to have that trust there. Now, when you get to the successful place, it's hard to say, right? So we have like Steve Jobs, right? It's like the big example of a guy who was probably not super fun to work with, according to some reports, but still successful in turning Apple around. I don't know how cutthroat he was or wasn't. I mean, you hear about Bill Gates and just how cutthroat he could be with people.
Mhm.
I don't know. I would think that these are such small numbers. I mean, I think there's
Right.
also a broader cultural movement towards more mental health in everywhere we go. So the new um, CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, is the biggest proponent of sleep and mental health and recovery. And he and my old partner or old colleague Mike Gervais, they worked together for years.
Mhm.
Satya has taken Microsoft to heights it's never imagined. People don't talk about what a success Microsoft is right now. It's humming right along. They're doing great. They've
Uh-huh.
got a more diversified product line, um, and they're I don't know why we overlook them as like doing some really great innovative things. And their current leadership is certainly at least ostensibly humanly focused and focused
Mhm.
on recovery, focused on mindset, focused on mental health. And
Right.
so, regardless of how we got here, I think the movement now will be towards a greater tolerance of strategies to improve mental health and entrepreneurial mindset in any organization, and a greater intolerance of people who aren't willing to do that. Now,
Uh-huh.
is that going to be a full cutoff? I certainly
Right.
encourage my students to be as human focused as they can.
Mhm.
Um, and maybe some of that sinks in, but I think um, you really can't get very far in life if you can't inspire people to trust you. And one of the greatest ways to get people to trust you is through gratitude. And
Right.
gratitude can take many forms. It doesn't mean that people need to be super happy and lovey and get together all the time. You can be quite grateful to someone who is indeed very serious but
Mhm.
provides for you a meaningful opportunity. So I'm not saying is that
Mhm.
people who are grateful are super flowery, happy people all the time, but they build good relationships by demonstrating value and by rewarding people's efforts to benefit them.
Uh-huh.
And that doesn't have to be necessarily the an extremely warm and fuzzy kind of situation. I think it can be, but it doesn't have to be. So it's
Uh-huh.
really a matter of kind of it's a matter of nuance to see how these emotional states play out with people. That
Right.
optimism, right, which is often maligned, but in fact is yet again an extremely important predictor of mental health.
Mhm.
And optimism is really just seeing that what we do now can improve and affect the future.
Uh-huh.
And it's very cognitive based. So there's hope, which is kind of the emotional cousin of optimism, but optimism is really a cognitive framing of things. It's not necessarily thinking the glass is half full kind of thing. It's not really what
Mhm.
optimism shakes out to be. And so there's a certain skill and a certain mindset of optimism that can be trained, but also kind of defies our expectation of what an optimistic person looks like. A
Uh-huh.
truly optimistic person may not seem very positive, but they see ways to get things done. So the
Right.
same it goes with people can be very ethical, very kind leaders, but might actually be rather austere, you know.
Mhm.
So these things are not just all one thing. They can be anybody can be a grateful person, and truly grateful and can benefit other people's lives through their own work and sacrifice. And
Right.
it can appear in many different wrappers.
Mhm. So in terms of these personality differences you mentioned, it seems like entrepreneurs are probably higher in openness in terms of generating ideas, conscientiousness in terms of working hard, low neuroticism in terms of emotional resilience, maybe extroverted in terms of pitching your ideas. And then agreeableness seems like the one that might vary the most in terms of
Yeah.
whether you're going to be very competitive or whether you're going to be very empathetic and looking out um, for the types of positive work experiences you were just mentioning.
Yeah, it's an interesting rundown. I have to look into it. Actually, you're
Mhm.
asking a really good question. I don't know the current research on it. The low neuroticism is an interesting one, in
Mhm.
that it could go either way. I think definitely openness, conscientiousness is really of the big five. The conscientiousness is really the
Uh-huh.
big one of the big five in terms of predicting a lot of mental health outcomes. And so I think you will see that a lot in successful founders as a conscientiousness. There's something
Mhm.
called cognitive tuning for founders where they are so in touch with the opportunities that they may be faced with that are around them that they're literally tuned they have cognitive tuning looking for value propositions around them. And that's a good way of saying conscientiousness. So my prediction, without knowing the literature super well here, would match yours very well. And agreeableness is interesting in that it's a very context dependent sort of thing, right? So, I mean, it might differ based on your role in the entrepreneurial spectrum. If you're a venture capitalist, you may not be very agreeable, or if you're an angel investor or something like that, it may vary. And then it can vary by situation. You may be a founder who is very agreeable to having a team that works in a certain way, or that provides feedback in a certain way, but not very agreeable about other things. So agreeableness is an interesting one. I know it's, you also have to separate these terms from like our common usage from how the research sees them. So optimism is a good example of that. Of our common use of the word optimism doesn't really match up with how we think about it in research. So I'd have to look more into that. But I think
so. What is optimism from the scientific standpoint?
It's a fundamental disposition toward the future, which states that we have a role in creating and changing the future based on our behavior now.
So what would the antithesis of that be?
It would
that
be
kind of seems obvious.
Yeah, it'd be that what we do doesn't matter, right? So it's pessimism is really
that makes sense.
That what we do doesn't matter, right? That what we do doesn't matter. That's pessimism. Is that it doesn't matter, like look at the state of the world, Adam. Like we have social inequality, we have climate change. These are two massive problems. They're probably linked in really interesting ways that we're not thinking about. But let's say climate change. And people right now are kind of split on optimism or pessimism, in the sense that like there's a pessimistic view, which is what I do doesn't matter, and it won't make a difference in the future. And maybe that's true, or maybe that's not. But we know that actually no. We know it's not true. We know it's not true because if enough people change their behavior, we'd see progress on this stuff. We absolutely know that. And we've seen that before. We've seen that in so many things. We have fixed environmental problems in our past. There are reasons, quote unquote, for optimism, meaning there are reasons to change our behavior to make the future better. They have to happen at scale now, whereas before I think it could have been each of us pitching in. And I'm no different than your average person in that regard. But the optimistic take is no, do what you can, chip away at it. And try to minimize your footprint a little bit. If we all do that, things get better. So the pessimistic view is that you don't. And so the opposite of optimism is not realism. It's not realism. And the research has shown that actually people who are very high in optimism tend to be very low in denial. You give them a very tough circumstance, the people who are highest in optimism actually show the most understanding of the tough circumstance, the closest acceptance and understanding of the tough circumstance, not lower levels of denial. So the opposite of optimism is pessimism. It is not realism. In fact, realism and optimism have kind of an interesting little handshake agreement. And sometimes you need to be a little bit of a pathological optimist to think, no, it might seem improbable. That's where the entrepreneurs come in. They're like, however improbable it is that this company will go forward, I still see a path for it. And it might not be very probable, but I see a path that maybe other people don't. Some people may call that denial of reality. I don't think it necessarily, sometimes it has to do with reality, sometimes it doesn't, right? So denial is just denial. Denial is just like, it's its own problem, but optimism and denial are kind of cousins, but certainly not opposites.
Right. So within an optimistic framework, how does that play out temporally? So you could imagine, let's say everything you do matters, but you could do things that matter that'll benefit you short-term versus long-term. So from a neuroscience perspective, I imagine it might be related to like delayed gratification.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the best example are our daily habits, right? Like you brush your teeth as an act of optimism. Flossing your teeth is an act of optimism, that like you floss every day. Each individual time you floss your teeth is not super fun. It takes about 90 seconds. It's not great,
A
but you
good
do it every
philosophy
day.
then, if you're doing it for 90 seconds.
It takes whatever, however
Mhm.
long it is, right? I think that's what my dentist said. It's like 90
Uh-huh.
seconds, it'll save your teeth, or whatever
Yeah.
he said, and it stuck with me. It stuck with me, and I'm like, yeah, I can do 90 seconds. So
Mhm.
you learn that it's these daily habits are in many ways acts of optimism, and the more automatic they can become. I'm not a habit expert, by the way, but
Mhm.
the more automatic, quote unquote, they become, then the more likely you are to realize their benefit.
Uh-huh.
So on a time scale, you have a sorts of all sorts of variances, I'm sure, in optimism in your time scale. People aren't flossing their teeth every day being like, I'm an optimist, right? You just floss your teeth and whatever, right? So
Uh-huh.
there are certain things, and then there are certain things where you're like, you know what? I am going to apply for that job. I am going to launch this product. I am at this moment going to send that email. I'm going to try to get that phone call. I'm going to start a podcast, Adam. You're going to do whatever. And those are kind of near term things where you're like, I believe
Uh-huh.
I can do something cool here. I'm interested in what's going to happen. And
Right.
so they set themselves up like that. So optimism, I think you're right. Absolutely, it has a time scale. And
Mhm.
people vary considerably, of course, on a moment to moment basis. So like
Yeah.
sometimes they're more this or that on things. Some people are not optimistic about this, and there's a lot of nuance here.
Right.
Nobody. It's not a 0 or 1, and it's not one dimension or all dimension. Some people
Mhm.
may be very pessimistic about their health outcome, but very optimistic about their work outcomes.
Right. So in entrepreneurship, I'm guessing it's more like long-term versus very long-term. So you could imagine, let's say, you could make a certain business decision that will bring heavy profits in the next 5 years, but maybe it contributes to global warming or some long-term potential risk. Or you could say something like, this is going to be a heavy upfront cost, but there's a chance that long-term it's like a huge payoff. And I would imagine that in the definition we laid out earlier, both of those are optimistic statements because they're saying like, well, we're doing this for a big payoff in either case, but it's more like how what's your time scale on that payoff? And
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really just more a connection that like I can have a role in whether or not this works,
uh-huh.
right? I think time scale or not, I think it's more just the mentality that um that this is something that I can choose to do that could work, that could benefit
Mm-hmm.
um myself and my situation, and that I think I can make this happen.
Mm-hmm.
That's all it is. I mean, I don't think the time scale is, I think, less important. I think the dimension is the more interesting part of like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, like this thing that I'm doing, like I'll never make this work. I'll never make this relationship work. Entrepreneurship is really tough on personal relationships.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so there might be a sense of, choosing. There might be some optimism that no, I can't make this work, or I can, or whatever. And by the way, also, optimism is not necessarily, like quitting, and optimism is another weird relationship, right? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
um, I can no longer make this work. Is that person no longer an optimist? I mean, not really. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to paint this with too broad a brush. I think that there's lots of different dimensions. Like some people are willing to
Right.
sacrifice a lot for an organization, and some people aren't, and some
Mm-hmm.
people find a way to make it happen, and it's very, very, very variable to say
Yeah.
the least. To put it mildly, it's just extremely variable
Mm-hmm.
on what dimensions and what we are. I mean, we're talking about human consciousness here.
Yeah. Yeah. So
A
we
lot
talked a
to it.
lot about personality and differences in terms of emotion and cognition. Are there any actual brain differences? Have you done scanning studies of like people who are entrepreneurs or soldiers or anything versus like your average person?
Um, Not really. I mean, so I have not done those studies. We
Hmm.
did studies when I was, here's a very vague example that there might be differences. There might be. Um, there's a few well-known examples. So we published a study in 2007, long time ago, with my old team at Stanford. Published a study where we saw a structural difference in a region of the brain based upon reading ability, right?
Hmm.
So we found that there's this one part of the brain near the corpus callosum, and it had, when we looked at the fibers, it had a little difference in its diffusion, or a difference in like the shape of the axons there, right?
Mhm.
And it was correlated with reading ability. So it's really interesting, right? So,
Uh-huh.
if that small difference was there, we know from musicians, they have different anatomical changes up here in
Mhm.
the motor region. We know
Uh-huh.
also that there's differences in terms of the functional changes that take place as a result of expertise, where
Mhm.
certain kinds of skills become more biased towards the brainstem, the more central, deeper regions of the brain,
That's
versus
interesting.
other skills. Yeah, so like more things that can be done more intuitively. So like I
Yeah.
think it was like race car drivers. It was something like that.
Uh-huh.
That's an example. I'm not sure that's
So
the same.
brainstem is more like quick and automatic as opposed to like
Yeah.
taking deep
Yeah,
thought.
less pros and cons kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
And so some of these areas of expertise, driving is a good example, right? That like it takes less and less of your brain to drive your car, which is
Mhm.
good. And then other studies have shown that as you become an expert, more and more of your brain is used. So like chess finds that people who become good at chess, it finds that they're more using more and more of their brain, so to speak,
Mhm.
as they play, because they're actually learning to change how they feel about the chessboard, and
Uh-huh.
that's the interesting part about it, I think. But
Right.
so insofar as like what does if there are brain scans that could determine a successful entrepreneur from a non-successful entrepreneur? No, not right
Yeah.
now. There are only a handful of neuroimaging studies of
Mhm.
entrepreneurs, and so we're trying to gear up for that
Yeah.
the next couple of years here. But definitely successful Marines, not successful Marines. No, definitely not right
Mhm.
now. It's really hard to tell. I mean, it's a hard study,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
there might be. I mean, I just want to say there might be differences, but none that
Yeah.
are known, and none that would be particularly important or actionable for people on a
Yeah.
day-to-day basis.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those other studies you mentioned have a really interesting trade-off because on one hand, there's like the whole your brain becomes more efficient and uses less energy versus you're using more energy because you're more engaged.
Yep. But when you're seeing it and feeling it from different angles, whereas the other one it's based on the less noise, the better,
Uh-huh.
right? The more your instinct can kick in. There's a guy that I recommend everybody read. His name is Gary Klein, and he's studied this expert intuition. I don't know Gary or anything, but he wrote a book called The Sources of Power, and I'm finishing it now.
Hmm.
And he talks a lot about all the instinctive things that we do to become experts at stuff. Super interesting.
Uh-huh.
So in those cases, like he talks a lot about first responders and firefighters who begin to know and understand when a building's about to collapse without knowing why. They just get a feeling literally and go, let's get out of here. And then there's all kinds of studies about this. And so their forms of decision making, we like to think are going to be, let me just think about more things more quickly and then find the right one. It's actually not the way that these people make decisions. They just kind of know the right decision right away.
Uh-huh. So it's like a gut feeling.
Yeah, literally. And it's like they just kind of know the right decision.
Hmm. Wow.
And it's really weird. They don't have five different options and they weigh the options and pick the best one. That's really not how high level decision making goes, even in the business context. It's really weird.
Uh-huh.
There's something about lots and lots and lots of practice doing something where you just kind of know what's right. And it's not that you pick from four or five different options, although sometimes you absolutely do, of course. When you
Uh-huh.
have the time and you can deliberate, that's a fantastic way to make decisions. So I'm all pro reason,
Right.
pro rationality. Like it absolutely is
Hmm.
a huge advantage. But there's a lot of evidence to show that these kind of subtle intuitive markers are really powerful too. So
Right.
those are the things I'm super interested in, especially for entrepreneurs and
Hmm.
their ability to innovate and to lead teams and to find new products based entirely on intuition. They go, no, I think this is going to work. Like,
Right.
what gives them that feeling? I don't know. It's just really
Yeah.
cool.
It seems like a very good question for neuroscience to ask, like, to what
Yeah.
extent are those intuitions really just like quick brain processing unconsciously?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's going to be based on expertise. They're not lucky guesses. I don't want anybody
Hmm.
thinking I'm saying they make lucky guesses, because that's not at all how it works. It's more that they've just spent years thinking about it. And the more you
Uh-huh.
spend thinking about something, the better you get at it.
Uh-huh. Right. So it gets to the
Magic.
point where your brain can like do it quickly, unconsciously,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah. I have a friend named Dan Dorcas. We're working on a few things together, and he's an emergency room doctor. And he's another Keck ER doc. And he and I spend a lot of time talking about where do you get good at stuff? It's a super interesting question. And yeah, and so he talked a lot about his ability to drive his intuition as a doctor in the emergency setting of like just kind of knowing what's right to do. Super interesting. But I think it breaks a lot of the barriers we have about cognition and emotion. And people saying, oh, don't get emotional. It's like usually terrible advice. Usually our advice should really be use emotion correctly, not don't get emotional. So,
yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with Antonio Damasio's work about how you actually need emotion to even push you over the edge of like making a decision.
yeah, I mean, he was my grad school advisor. So
yeah.
Yeah, so definitely. I know him pretty well. Yeah.
Cool. So Glenn, is there anything else you want to talk about, like ongoing studies or future work that we should talk about?
No, I would say, sorry about that. I would say that, I mean, I think people could follow me, would be really cool. Join me on LinkedIn and Twitters. I talk about Found Well, which is my new program for entrepreneurial mindset, where we take cohorts of young founders and put them through the paces and learn for them to develop their own entrepreneurial mindset, which is really cool. And I really just, if anybody's interested in this stuff, just like keep reading. I've listed 9 or 10 different sources and authors, and people should feel free to connect with me if they like, if this sort of thing is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll link your website and your social media in the description below.
That'd be great. Well, thank you for wonderful questions, Adam.
Thank you very much for your time, Glenn.
All right, we'll talk to you later.